Okay, so picture this. There's a neighborhood in Tokyo called Kichijoji. It has a train station, a park, a jazz scene, and one of the most famous shopping streets in the city. For years, it topped the rankings as the most desirable place to live in all of Greater Tokyo. And somewhere in this neighborhood, you'd expect to find a temple called Kichijoji. There isn't one. The temple named Kichijoji exists, but it's on the other side of the city, in Bunkyo Ward, about 12 kilometers east of here. The neighborhood of Kichijoji has no temple called Kichijoji. The name and the place it came from were separated centuries ago. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the winter of 1657. In 1657, the city of Edo, what we now call Tokyo, was destroyed by fire. The Great Fire of Meireki. It burned for 3 days. It consumed roughly 2/3 of the city. The death toll is still debated by historians. Estimates range from 30,000 to as many as 100,000 people. The keep of Edo Castle burned down and was never rebuilt. It remains missing from the castle grounds to this day. Among the areas that burned was the neighborhood around a Buddhist temple called Kichijoji, located near what is now Suidobashi in the center of the city. The people who lived in the streets surrounding that temple lost everything. Their homes, their land, their livelihoods, gone in 3 days. The Tokugawa shogunate used the aftermath of the fire to redesign Edo from the ground up. Displaced residents were pushed outward. The land they had lived on was converted into samurai estates and fire breaks. The people who had gathered around Kichijoji Temple were assigned new land to the west, on the Musashino Plateau, a vast stretch of largely undeveloped wilderness at the time. This was not a choice. It was an order. The settlers were placed along the Itsukaichi Kaido, one of the old highways leading out of Edo toward the mountains. They were given plots of land in a long, narrow format, a house facing the road with a deep strip of farmland running behind it. They were told to build a village. The temple itself did not follow them. Kichijoji Temple was eventually relocated to Honkomagome in Bunkyo Ward, where it still stands today. But the people couldn't go back. There was nothing to go back to. So they did something quietly remarkable. They named their new village after the place they had lost. Kichijoji Mura, Kichijoji Village. No temple, no gate, no connection to the original site, just a name carried westward by people who had been forced to start over. The temple stayed. The name didn't. That is why the neighborhood of Kichijoji has no temple called Kichijoji. The name is not a description of what's here. It's a memory of what was left behind. The settlers who arrived on the Musashino Plateau found something at the southern edge of their new land. A pond. Not a remarkable pond at first glance, but this was Inokashira Pond, the body of water that sits at the heart of what is now Inokashira Park. And this pond was not just a pond. It was one of the primary water sources for the Kenda Josui, the aqueduct system that supplied drinking water to the city of Edo. The shogunate managed that water carefully. The pond and the land around it were designated as direct shogunal territory. Nobody could develop it. Nobody could touch it. It was protected not for aesthetic reasons, not for public recreation, but because the city downstream depended on it. And so for centuries, While the village of Kichijoji grew around it, that land stayed untouched. A forest and a pond, sitting at the edge of an expanding settlement, preserved by administrative necessity. Then, in 1889, the railway arrived. The line that would become the J.R. Chuo Line, then called the Kobu Railway, opened between Shinjuku and Tachikawa. 10 years later, in 1899, Kichijoji got its own station. The village that had been built by displaced Edo residents was now a commuter town. People came, shops opened. The area began to urbanize in the way that railway towns do, fast, practical, outward from the station in every direction, except to the south. To the south, there was still a forest and a pond that nobody could touch. In 1917, that land was designated as Inokashira Onshi Park, Onshi meaning gifted by the emperor. It became one of the earliest suburban parks in Japan, open specifically for urban residents who needed green space outside the city. Here's the irony. The shogunate protected that land because it was a water source. They had no intention of creating a park, but by the time the city needed parks, the land had already been protected for 2.5 centuries, and it was the only large stretch of greenery left in the area. The thing that blocked development became the neighborhood's greatest asset. Walk out of Kichijoji Station today and you reach the edge of that forest in about 5 minutes. In a city where land 5 minutes from a major station is among the most valuable real estate on earth. There's a pond, a rowing lake, and over 100 species of birds. That didn't happen by design. It happened because the water had to be protected, and the protection outlasted the reason for it. August 1945. Japan surrendered, and the country began the process of rebuilding from near total devastation. Around Kichijoji Station, as in countless other places, an informal market appeared almost immediately. People selling food, clothing, cigarettes, everyday goods, outside the official rationing system, outside the law, a black market, like hundreds of others that sprang up across post-war Japan. Over time, this market settled into a specific location, a cluster of narrow alleys just north of the station exit. Small stalls became small structures. Structures became permanent shops. The alleys filled up with drinking establishments, tiny restaurants, vendors of every description. At some point, a writer named Kame Katsuichiro, one version of the story goes, described the rows of small storefronts packed into those tight alleyways as resembling the holes of a harmonica. The name Harmonica Yokocho stuck. Harmonica Alley. Kichijoji was by then a genuinely valuable piece of real estate. The argument for tearing down Harmonica Yokocho and replacing it with a modern building was, from a purely economic standpoint, obvious. The land was worth far more than what those small shops were generating. But the redevelopment didn't happen. The reason was the ownership structure. Over the decades since the black market days, the land and buildings of Harmonica Yokocho had been divided, subdivided, leased, subleased, and transferred through multiple generations of owners and tenants. The rights were so fragmented and the number of parties involved so large that reaching a unified agreement was effectively impossible. And the people running those shops, many of whom had built their businesses there over decades, refused to leave. The people who had been displaced before were not going to be displaced again. The post-war black market created a tangle of ownership so complex that it accidentally protected itself from the forces that would have erased it. Harmonica Yokocho is still there today, largely unchanged in structure, a narrow grid of small bars and restaurants that opens every evening as it has for decades. In 2008, Kichijoji topped a major residential desirability survey for the greater Tokyo area for the first time. The ingredients that put it there were real. A major railway hub, the JR Chuo line to Shinjuku in roughly 15 minutes, the Keio Inokashira line to Shibuya in about 30, a large park with a forest and a pond 5 minutes from the station, a dense network of shopping streets, Sun Road, Diamond Street, Nakamichi Dori, offering everything from department stores to independent shops, and a cultural identity built around jazz, subculture, independent record stores, and a long association with manga artists and writers who had made the neighborhood their home. These things were not manufactured. They had accumulated over decades. The desirability was genuine, but the ranking created its own momentum. Media coverage of the ranking brought more attention. More attention brought more people. More people drove up property values. Rising property values pushed up commercial rents. And rising rents began to push out the things that had made the neighborhood desirable in the first place. The small independent record stores that had defined Kichijoji's cultural character couldn't afford the new rents. The jazz bars closed. The idiosyncratic shops that attracted the artists and the students gave way to the kind of national chain stores you find in every major shopping district in Japan. And the people who had created that culture, the ones for whom Kichijoji's particular character had been the reason to be there, started to move. West along the Chuo line to Nishi Ogikubo, further west to Mitaka, out to Kokubunji. Neighborhoods where the rents are lower, where the character that Kichijoji used to have is still affordable to maintain. A slow dispersal of the things that made Kichijoji what it was, spreading outward along the train line like ink diffusing through water. In 1657, the residents of a temple neighborhood were pushed west onto the Musashino Plateau. In 1945, people with nothing built a market in the ruins around a train station. Now, the culture that built Kichijoji's reputation is being pushed further west, looking for the next place to land. The displacement didn't stop in 1657. It never stopped. There is no temple called Kichijoji in Kichijoji. But maybe that's exactly the point. This neighborhood was never built on permanence. It was built by people who were forced to leave somewhere else and had to make something new. The name came first, carried by people who had lost everything except the memory of where they'd been. The park came from a water source that outlived its original purpose. The most iconic alley in the neighborhood survived because the paperwork was too complicated to undo. Kichijoji has always been a place in the middle of moving. It still is. If you made it this far, thank you. If you want to see more stories like this from the parts of Japan that don't make it into the travel guides, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.